Your mind is your greatest weapon and your greatest trap. It will either build you into a warrior or break you into a prisoner. Most people train their bodies. They lift weights. They practice moves. They build muscle. But they forget the mind controls the body. And if your mind is weak, no amount of physical strength will save you when life strikes. I didn't become Bruce Lee because I was stronger, faster, or more gifted. I became who I am because I trained my belief system like a fighter sharpens his blade. I reprogrammed the way I thought, the way I spoke, the way I showed up until doubt had no place to live in me. The world didn't hand me confidence. I built it. I sculpted my mindset with discipline, shaped it with struggle, and guarded it like it was sacred. And if you want to know how to rise above limits, to silence the voice that keeps telling you you can't, and to build a mind that refuses to break, then don't just listen. Look within. Because belief isn't something you find. It's something you become. One. I stopped worshiping limits. From a very young age, I began to notice a pattern in how the world conditions people to think small. The moment a child expresses a dream, society rushes to put a ceiling on it. They say, be realistic, as if caution is more valuable than courage. But what they call realism, I came to understand as disguised fear. They weren't preparing me for life. They were unconsciously handing me the chains of limitation, chains they had accepted for themselves. That's when I made one of the most important decisions of my life. I refused to worship limits. I stopped treating them like they were sacred boundaries that couldn't be touched. I started questioning everything the world told me I couldn't do. When someone said, "That's not possible," instead of stepping back, I leaned in and asked, "According to who?" If a door looked locked, I didn't walk away. I looked for the hinge. The problem is that most people never pause to ask where these limits actually come from. They assume that because a teacher, a friend, or even a parent said something can't be done, it must be true. But truth isn't inherited. It's discovered. I realized that most of the so-called limits people live by were not natural laws. They were just hand-me-down beliefs built on fear, failure, or frustration. And I made a vow never to accept someone else's ceiling as the height of my own life. I trained my mind to stop bowing down to doubts, to stop shrinking around resistance, and to stop playing small just to make others comfortable. Whenever life tried to corner me, whether it was because of my ethnicity, my accent, my size, or my different approach to martial arts, I didn't react with anger or despair. I responded with clarity. I knew exactly who I was, and I knew that belief shapes reality far more than circumstance ever could. The world told me a Chinese man couldn't lead a film in America, that my philosophy wouldn't be understood, that my ideas were too unconventional to be taken seriously. And I understood that none of those statements were about me. They were about their limits, not mine. So I didn't argue with them. I simply lived in a way that made those opinions irrelevant. I let my movements speak louder than their doubt. What changed everything for me was the realization that limits only have power when you treat them like truth. The moment you question them not with arrogance, but with bold curiosity, they begin to crack. You must understand, there is a difference between respecting reality and submitting to it. I respected challenges, but I never submitted to limitation. I saw every so-called impossible moment as a chance to rise, to expand, to test how far the human spirit could really go when it stopped asking for permission and started owning its power. True transformation begins the moment you stop assuming that the walls around you are fixed. They are not. They are often illusions built from other people's pain and passed down like law. And if you're brave enough to challenge them, you'll see that what once looked like a wall is actually a door in disguise. But you must be the one to knock, to push, and if necessary, to break through. No one else will do it for you. That's what I did. I stopped letting the world tell me what I was allowed to believe. I stopped playing by rules written by those who were afraid to live fully. And in doing that, I found something powerful, freedom, not just of body, but of mind. And once your mind becomes free, once you stop worshiping the lie of limitation, nothing can control you, not fear, not doubt, not even failure. You become something rare, a person who decides what's possible instead of waiting to be told. 2, I made my mind stronger than my feelings. One of the most powerful realizations I came to in my life was this: your feelings are not facts. And if you allow them to lead you, they will take you down paths you never intended to walk. The truth is, emotions are unstable. They change from moment to moment, often without reason. One day you feel like a champion. The next you feel like quitting. One moment you're calm, and the next you're overwhelmed by anger or doubt or fear. Most people live in this emotional cycle their entire lives, constantly reacting to how they feel instead of responding from who they are. But I made a different choice. I chose to train my mind to be stronger than my feelings, because I knew that if I didn't take control of my emotions, they would take control of me, and that's no way to live with power. Every day I trained, I was not just building muscle or technique, I was training the part of myself that most people ignore, the ability to act despite emotion. There were countless mornings when I didn't feel like getting out of bed, when the soreness from the day before made every movement painful. There were moments when rejection, failure, or the pressure to succeed made me question my path. But those feelings were never allowed to decide my actions. I had made a commitment, and my commitment was stronger than my moods. That's how you build real strength, not by doing things when they feel good, but by doing them when they don't. That is how a warrior moves. That is how belief becomes unshakable. The mind is not just a place for thought, it's a command center. And if it is not trained, it will be ruled by every fleeting emotion that passes through you. I had to become aware of my inner dialogue. I noticed how easily the mind can be hijacked by doubt, how quickly it reacts to stress, how naturally it tries to protect you from discomfort. But protection is not growth. Safety is not strength. I taught myself to see emotions as signals, not commands. Anger might rise, but it didn't have to speak for me. Fear might appear, but it didn't have to make my decisions. Sadness might visit, but it didn't get to steer the wheel. I gave that job to discipline. I gave that job to clarity. And I never let temporary emotions rewrite the permanent standards I had set for my life. You must understand this. Feelings are not the enemy, but they are not the leader either. They are part of you, but they are not the entirety of you. Just because something feels hard doesn't mean it's wrong. Just because something feels overwhelming doesn't mean it's beyond your capacity. And just because you feel tired doesn't mean you should stop. I taught myself to respect my emotions, but never to serve them. That's where most people fail. They let emotions lead and then wonder why their life feels unstable. I refused to be unstable. I chose to anchor myself in something deeper purpose. Your mind can become stronger than your feelings, but not by accident. It happens through repetition, through challenge, through choosing action over comfort again and again. Every time you move forward despite fear, you train your mind to obey your purpose instead of your panic. Every time you remain calm in chaos, you send a message to your brain: we do not break here. That is how mental resilience is formed. That is how you begin to trust yourself on a level that no mood can shake. So I ask you this: are you letting your emotions guide your life, or are you guiding them? Are you reacting to every wave, or are you learning to surf above the storm? Because when your mind becomes stronger than your feelings, life doesn't get easier, but you become unshakable. You stop needing everything to feel right, and you start becoming the one who moves right, no matter what. That's not just belief, that's control, that's power. And once you have that, no external force, no fear, no failure, no person can break your direction. You move with intent. You speak with certainty. You live with mastery. That is how I lived. That is how I trained. And that is why I never let my feelings decide who I was. 3. I removed weak voices from my life, including my own. There's something most people never realize. Your mind is like a garden, and the voices you allow into it are like seeds. Some grow into strength, clarity, and purpose. Others grow into weeds, doubt, distraction, fear. If you're not vigilant, your environment will quietly shape your belief system. The people you listen to, the words you repeat, the thoughts you entertain, all of them build your reality. I became very aware of this early in my journey. I began to notice how easy it was for even one weak voice to begin corrupting a strong mindset. And so I made a decision not just to train my body, not just to sharpen my technique, but to defend my mental space like a warrior guards his life. That meant removing every weak voice from my life. And yes, that included the ones that came from within. The world is full of people who will tell you to slow down, be careful, take it easy. They think they're helping. They call it concern. But what they're really doing, most of the time, is projecting their own fears onto you. Their doubts become suggestions. Their insecurities disguise themselves as advice. And if you're not careful, you start shrinking, not because you failed, but because you listened. I understood that if I wanted to live at the highest level of myself, I couldn't afford to let those voices rent space in my mind. Whether it was friends who didn't believe in what I was building, mentors who tried to put limits on my vision, or society itself trying to reduce me to a stereotype, I filtered everything. I asked myself constantly, is this voice building me or breaking me? But here's what people miss. The most dangerous voice is not the one outside you. It's the one that lives inside. That voice that whispers when you're alone. The one that says, you're not ready. The one that says, what if you fail? The one that makes you hesitate, overthink, and doubt your own power. I didn't just confront that voice, I reprogrammed it. I trained it. I rewired it with repetition. When that voice told me I was tired, I reminded it I had more in the tank. When it told me I wasn't good enough, I pointed to my discipline. I made that inner voice reflect my purpose to know, my fear. To reprogram your mind, you must become conscious of your inputs. That means guarding what you hear, what you watch, what you repeat. It means stopping conversations that drain you of your spirit. It means walking away from people who constantly operate from limitation. Sometimes that even means outgrowing people you once loved because they don't have the capacity to support your growth. And most importantly, it means confronting your own internal dialogue and asking, is this voice mine? Or was it planted in me by someone else's fear? I didn't wait for the world to get quiet. I silenced what needed to be silenced. I didn't wait for everyone to agree with me. I became so deeply connected to my path that I no longer needed approval to move forward. And when my own mind tried to betray me with doubt, I didn't argue with it. I overruled it with action. I didn't need permission. I didn't seek validation. I built a belief system that could survive isolation. Because when you remove the noise, what you're left with is clarity. And that clarity becomes unshakable power. Understand this clearly. The voices you allow into your mind are shaping the life you live. You cannot build a strong identity with weak input. You cannot expect high-level belief if you are surrounded by low-level thinking. And you will never rise if you are constantly tuning into fear, whether it's on your screen, in your circle, or inside your head. If you want to program your mind for limitless belief, start by auditing what you listen to. Start by speaking to yourself with strength. Start by choosing thoughts that align with the person you're becoming, not the person you're trying to escape. This is how I protected my mind. This is how I created focus in a world full of noise. This is how I became unbreakable, no just in body, but in belief. Because the mind cannot operate at full power if it is infected with doubt. So I cleansed it, I disciplined it, and I never, ever allowed a weak voice to become my truth. 4. I turned discipline into a language my body understood. Most people hear the word discipline and think of restriction, of rules, of sacrifice. They associate it with punishment, with something unpleasant they must endure. But I saw it differently. To me, discipline was not a burden, it was a language. It was how I communicated with my body, how I sent signals to my mind about who I was becoming. Every repetition, every session, every time I pushed myself beyond what was comfortable, I was writing a message into my nervous system. That message was simple but powerful. This is who I am now. And that identity, forged in discipline, became stronger than fatigue, louder than excuses, and more permanent than any emotion I felt in the moment. You must understand your body listens to you, but not in words. It learns through repetition. It adapts based on what you demand from it consistently. If you show up when you feel good but disappear when you feel tired, you're teaching your system that comfort comes first. But when you move, train, and execute, regardless of your mood, you begin to teach your body a different truth, that your actions are not controlled by feeling, but by decision. And that is the foundation of a warrior's belief system. You stop relying on motivation. You stop needing ideal conditions. You start building a rhythm where showing up becomes automatic, not something you debate. When I trained, I wasn't just doing it to become faster or stronger. I was hardwiring precision into my movements, calmness into my reactions, and consistency into my lifestyle. I was teaching myself that discipline wasn't something I turned on and off. It was something I lived. The way I moved, the way I breathed, the way I approached each day, it all reflected my commitment. There was no separation between the martial artist and the man. Discipline wasn't a task. It was my identity. And once your identity aligns with your practice, belief becomes effortless. You no longer ask, can I do this? Because your behavior has already answered that question 1,000 times before. The secret most people never learn is that true discipline creates freedom. Because once your body is trained, once your mind understands your standards, you no longer waste energy on negotiation. You don't ask yourself whether to train today, you already know. You don't hesitate. When faced with difficulty, you've trained yourself to lean into it. That clarity gives you power. It gives you momentum. It removes hesitation, which is the enemy of progress. When your life runs on clear, practiced standards, you free up your focus to be creative, present, and deeply effective. I didn't achieve mastery because I was born with extraordinary talent. I achieved it because I treated every small action as part of a larger conversation between my identity and my future. I paid attention to how I walked, how I stood, how I approached even the simplest routine. I turned repetition into ritual, and in that process, I rewired not just my habits, but my sense of self. That's the difference between someone who trains and someone who evolves. One builds a skill. The other becomes something new entirely. If you want to reprogram your belief, don't start by thinking big. Start by doing small things with absolute discipline. Wake up with purpose. Move with intent. Practice with full presence. Show up when it's hard. Speak with clarity. And repeat. Again and again. Until those actions speak louder than the voice of weakness ever could. Over time, you will notice something shift. Your body will begin to respond differently. Your reactions will become calmer. Your movements will become more efficient. Your decisions will carry more weight. That is the moment you know you've crossed the line from doing discipline to becoming it. And when you become disciplined, belief no longer feels like something you need to convince yourself of. It becomes the air you breathe. You no longer have to try to be confident. You live as someone who honors his word. You no longer chase motivation. You operate from principle. You don't need to prove anything because everything you do, every day, already proves it. That is how I trained. That is how I moved. That is how I became Bruce Lee, not by talent alone, but by using discipline as a language my body understood, a language that wrote belief into every part of who I was until there was nothing left but precision, focus, and unshakable identity. 5. I reprogrammed failure into feedback. One of the greatest turning points in my life came when I stopped treating failure as something to avoid and started recognizing it as one of the most intelligent forces I could ever learn from. Most people grow up with a fear of failure planted deep inside them. They're taught that failure is embarrassing, that it's a sign of weakness, that it means you're not good enough. So they try to avoid it. They play small. They stay in safe zones. They only attempt what they're already good at. But that mindset keeps them locked in a mental prison where growth is almost impossible. I knew that if I wanted to evolve beyond the limits of what was considered normal, I would have to completely reprogram the way I saw failure. I stopped seeing it as rejection. I started seeing it as data. Every time I missed a punch, slipped on timing, or lost to someone faster or stronger, I didn't take it personally. I took it as information. I studied the movement. I analyzed the moment. I asked myself what I could adjust, what I could refine, what I could sharpen. Because to me, failure wasn't a statement about who I was. It was a conversation about who I could become. This small shift in mindset created a massive change in my results. I no longer felt fear walking into challenges because I wasn't measuring my worth by whether I succeeded. I was measuring my growth by what I learned. The reason most people never reach their potential is not because they're incapable. It's because they internalize failure. They touch discomfort and immediately label themselves as broken, slow, unworthy. They fall once and call themselves a failure. But I saw that kind of thinking as flawed, shallow, and ultimately self-sabotaging. You cannot evolve if you take every loss as a personal insult. You evolve when you understand that failure is a mirror. It shows you your blind spots. It exposes the weak links in your system. It gives you precise feedback on what needs to be improved. And if you're willing to listen, without ego, every master you admire, every fighter, philosopher, or leader has failed more times than you've tried. The only difference is that they didn't stop. They didn't interpret those failures as a dead end. They saw them as redirection. That's how I moved. I trained with intensity, failed with intention, and responded with reflection. I didn't chase perfection. I chased refinement. I wasn't interested in looking flawless. I was obsessed with becoming effective. That's why every setback I faced became a step forward. Not instantly, not automatically, but through conscious effort to extract meaning from the pain. And let me be very clear, failure still hurts. It stings. It challenges your ego. It makes you doubt yourself in moments. But pain is not the enemy. Pain is the price of transformation. The difference is that I didn't let pain become a reason to quit. I let it become a reason to sharpen my edge. I would ask myself, what did this teach me? And how can I come back stronger? And then I would apply the lesson immediately. Not tomorrow, not after thinking about it for a week, right now. Because if failure offers you a blueprint and you ignore it, the loss becomes meaningless. But if you apply what you've learned, then even your darkest moments become fuel for mastery. There's a kind of peace that comes from embracing failure. It frees you. It takes away the pressure of being perfect and replaces it with a hunger to improve. You stop performing for others. and you start evolving for yourself. That's what I did. That's why I could experiment so fearlessly with my martial arts style, blending techniques, philosophies, and movements that others thought couldn't work together. I wasn't afraid to look wrong. I wasn't afraid to be criticized. Because I wasn't attached to being right, I was committed to discovering truth. If you want to program your mind for limitless belief, you must strip away the false identity you've built around never making mistakes. You must learn to stand in front of failure without shame. You must build the courage to fail in public, to fall in front of others, and to rise not because someone lifted you, but because you trained yourself to rise. That is the path of strength. That is the way of mastery. And that is the only road to unshakable self-belief. I challenge you to reframe every failure you've had. Instead of asking, why did this happen to me? Ask, what is this trying to teach me? Because that question shifts your identity from a victim of life to a student of life. And a student never loses. A student either learns or evolves. I never saw failure as a threat to my identity. I saw it as a vital process in becoming the man I needed to be. And once that becomes your mindset, you begin to realize something very powerful. Failure is not the end. It's not a signal to stop. It's a signal to adjust. It's not proof that you're weak. It's an invitation to get stronger. That's how I lived. That's how I trained. That's how I rose not above failure, but through it. 6. I trained my identity until it couldn't be broken. There is something most people never fully understand. Belief is not built through wishing, hoping, or even just thinking positively. Belief is the byproduct of identity. You don't just believe in yourself because you want to. You believe in yourself because you have become someone you can trust. The world tries to make you think that confidence is a mood, something that shows up when you succeed or when people praise you. But I never relied on that. I didn't build my belief on emotion or external approval. I built it on repetition, discipline, and a daily decision to become the kind of man who could not be shaken by temporary defeat, rejection, or judgment. I trained my identity so deeply that no one else could define it, not with their words, their opinions, or their doubts. You see, identity is not a label. It's a lived experience. Every day, with every action you take, you're teaching yourself who you are. If you constantly avoid discomfort, you're programming your identity to believe that you are fragile. If you keep quitting when things get difficult, you're teaching yourself that you can't be trusted under pressure. But if you show up consistently, even when it's hard, if you do the work when no one's watching, if you honor your commitments regardless of how you feel, you begin to carve out an identity that is resilient, reliable, and rooted in strength. And once that identity is formed, belief becomes automatic. You no longer need to hype yourself up or seek validation because you already know who you are. You've proven it to yourself. When I was building my philosophy, my art, my life, I didn't wait to become someone great. I acted in alignment with the identity I was creating long before the world saw it. I trained, walked, spoke, and moved like Bruce Lee, not the celebrity, not the icon, but the man I envisioned myself becoming. I shaped my language. I shaped my posture. I shaped my thoughts, not for show, but for internal alignment. Because when your behavior aligns with your purpose, belief becomes the natural side effect. It's not something you force, it's something that emerges from the consistency of your character. Most people try to feel confident before they act. That's the wrong order. You don't wait to believe, you act like someone who believes, and over time, that belief roots itself so deeply that even failure can't uproot it. That's what I did. I embodied the identity of the person I was becoming until there was no gap between my imagination and my reality. And when people tried to project their limits onto me, when they said I couldn't act, or I couldn't lead, or that my ideas wouldn't translate, I didn't react. I didn't defend myself. I didn't shrink. I simply kept showing up in alignment with my identity. I didn't need to convince them. I had already convinced myself through action. And that's what most people miss. You can't talk your way into belief. You have to act your way into it. You have to stack evidence for who you are, not just once, but daily. That means showing up in the small moments, in the invisible hours, in the places where no one applauds you. That's where identity is formed. Not in the spotlight, but in the shadows. When it's just you, your thoughts, and the mirror, that's where you decide what kind of person you really are. There were times in my life when things didn't go the way I hoped. Injuries, rejections, setbacks. But my identity was so deeply trained that I never questioned my path. I didn't say, maybe this isn't for me. I said, how do I adjust and keep going? Because when your identity is strong, you don't crumble under pressure. You become sharper. Adversity doesn't shake you, it refines you. And the world begins to respond differently. People don't follow someone who's perfect. They follow someone who's real, consistent, and anchored in who they are. The reason most people struggle with belief is not because they're not capable, it's because they keep breaking promises to themselves. They say they'll commit, and then they quit. They say they'll change, but then they make excuses. Over time, their mind learns not to trust their own words. That erosion of self-trust is what kills belief. That's why I lived in a way that made my word law. If I said I'd train, I trained. If I said I'd improve, I improved. I never waited for motivation. I let my identity do the work for me. And that's the real secret. When your identity is forged in fire, belief becomes your default setting. Not because you're arrogant, but because you've built something solid inside that no failure can shake. So if you want to believe in yourself at a level that can't be broken, stop chasing the feeling and start building the identity. Decide who you want to be. Then align every action, every decision, every moment with that vision. Don't flinch when it gets hard. Don't hesitate when the old version of you tries to come back. Keep moving forward until there's no room left for the imposter. When your life reflects your vision, belief becomes effortless. You don't need to convince anyone, not even yourself. You already know. That is how I trained. That is how I became who I am. Not through talent alone, but through identity. Not through hype, but through consistency. And that's what made my belief unshakable. Because it wasn't borrowed, it was built. 7. I acted like a master before the world saw one. Long before anyone called me a legend. Long before the films, the fame, or the recognition, I had already decided who I was. I didn't wait for success to give me permission to act successful. I didn't wait for approval to feel worthy. I moved, trained, and lived as if I had already stepped into the identity I was building. Because one of the most powerful truths I ever discovered is this: you don't become great by waiting for the world to notice you. You become great by embodying the mindset of greatness before the world is ready to see it. I acted like a master before anyone believed I was one. Not because I was faking it, but because I understood something most people never learn. The world reflects what you project. You see, most people make the mistake of waiting. They wait for validation before they commit. They wait for results before they believe. They wait for opportunity before they prepare. But that mindset is the reason so many remain stuck in the same place, year after year. They live in hesitation, in half effort, in doubt. They never go all in because they're afraid to look foolish. But I didn't care how I looked. I cared how I lived. I committed to the version of myself I envisioned, even before I had the results to prove it. That's not arrogance. That's alignment. And alignment is what allows your actions to pull your future into the present. When I entered a room, I didn't shrink myself based on who was watching. I didn't wait for people to acknowledge my presence. I carried myself with clarity and conviction because I had already done the internal work to know who I was. I had trained in the dark for hours while others rested, while others played, while others talked about dreams. I was living mine behind closed doors, preparing with the intensity of someone who knew that greatness was not about the spotlight. It was about how you carry yourself when no one is clapping yet. That inner certainty is not something you stumble into. It's something you build brick by brick through discipline, repetition, and consistency. When people said, "You're too short," I trained harder. When they said, "A Chinese man can't lead in Hollywood," I didn't protest, I proved. Not through argument, but through presence. I didn't act according to their standards. I acted according to my standard. And that's what created belief not only in me, but in others. Eventually, the world followed what I had already claimed internally. That's the power of embodiment. When you carry the energy of someone who already owns their space, the world adjusts. People begin to treat you differently. Not because they suddenly changed, but because you did. What most people don't realize is that belief becomes real the moment you stop negotiating with doubt. That's when your body begins to move with certainty. That's when your speech becomes direct. That's when your presence enters a room before you even speak. And I didn't develop that by accident. I trained it into myself by acting like the man I was becoming long before I was recognized as that man. I walked like Bruce Lee. I thought like Bruce Lee. I trained like Bruce Lee before the world ever knew the name. Understand this clearly. Your mind needs evidence to believe. And if you're not getting that evidence from the outside world yet, you must create it from your behavior. Every disciplined action, every early morning, every moment you follow through on your word, these become bricks in the foundation of belief. Over time, your system begins to understand, this is who I am now. And once that identity is locked in, you don't need to fake confidence, you radiate it. You don't chase success, it aligns with you. But this requires risk. It means showing up like you already belong in the space you're aiming for, even when others don't see it yet. It means speaking like someone who knows not, someone who's waiting for permission. It means acting like a professional while others are still calling you a beginner. This doesn't mean being blind to growth or immune to learning. In fact, it requires even more humility, because you must be willing to face discomfort, to stretch beyond your current skill, to fail publicly while still walking forward like a champion. That's what I did. And that's why I grew faster than others. Because I was mentally already there, long before life caught up. I didn't become who I am because I was the most accepted. I became who I am because I acted like it before anyone agreed. And through that posture, that mindset, that energy, I invited my future to meet me halfway. I lived my role before I was cast in it. And by the time the world caught up, I was already prepared, because I had already been living as the man I was destined to be. So ask yourself this: are you acting like the person you're waiting to become? Are your habits, your energy, your language aligned with your vision? Or are you still waiting for a sign, for someone else to say you're ready? Let me tell you now, you are the sign. Your daily actions are the signal. Your standard is your permission slip. And when you rise to meet it, belief doesn't become something you need to forsake. It becomes something that flows through everything you do. That is how I lived. That is how I trained. That is how I moved. Like the master I was becoming before the world was ready to see it. And that is why the world eventually had no choice but to see it too. 8. I protected my focus like it was sacred. In a world full of noise, distractions, and constant demands, one of the most difficult things to protect is not your time, but your focus. People think success is about doing more, achieving more, filling your schedule, staying busy. But I knew early on that busyness is not the same as progress. motion is not the same as mastery. I realized that the deeper I went into my craft, the more essential it became to simplify, to strip away what didn't matter, and to focus like a laser on what did. That's why I treated my focus like it was sacred, because I understood that without focus, even the most talented person becomes scattered, reactive, and ineffective. I wasn't interested in being everywhere. I wasn't trying to do everything. I didn't care about trends, attention, or chasing after what looked impressive. I cared about alignment between my mind, my body, and my mission. Every day, I asked myself one question: is this helping me become who I'm meant to be? If the answer was no, it didn't belong in my life. That included certain habits, certain relationships, and even certain thoughts. Because anything that diluted my focus, no matter how small, was a threat to my purpose. Most people don't fail because they're not capable. They fail because they're distracted. Their energy is spread too thin. Their attention is stolen by notifications, opinions, entertainment, and comparison. They're constantly reacting to the world instead of creating from within. But I chose a different path. I created space for depth. I protected my solitude. I structured my environment so that I could hear my own thoughts clearly. And in that clarity, I discovered a power most people never touch: the ability to go all in without hesitation, without noise, without second guessing. When I trained with complete presence. When I studied philosophy, I studied with full immersion. When I created my own style, Jeet Kune Do, I didn't look to copy others. I looked inward. Because focus isn't just about what you look at, it's about what you ignore. I ignored distractions. I ignored opinions. I ignored every voice that tried to pull me in a direction that didn't align with my truth. That discipline gave me an edge that no one could fake. And that edge wasn't built in one day. It was forged through thousands of small, deliberate choices to stay aligned. Even conversations had to meet a standard. If someone was constantly negative, constantly pulling me into drama, small talk, or surface level thinking, I didn't entertain it. Not out of arrogance, but out of clarity. I understood the cost of broken focus. Every time you allow someone or something to take you off path, you lose momentum. And momentum is sacred. Once it's gone, it's hard to rebuild. That's why I surrounded myself with people who respected my mission, who understood the value of silence, who added energy to my life instead of taking it. Your focus is your life force. If you waste it, your results will reflect that. But if you protect it like it's sacred, you begin to experience a different kind of clarity. You stop needing motivation because your environment becomes structured around your mission. You stop feeling overwhelmed because everything unnecessary has been cut away. You begin to make progress, not through effort alone, but through alignment. You don't just work harder, you work smarter. You don't just move, you move with purpose. I didn't become Bruce Lee by being available to everyone. I didn't become who I am by saying yes to everything. I became who I am by choosing one path and walking it with intensity, presence, and devotion. Focus is not about doing more. It's about doing less with more power. Most people dilute their potential by constantly switching direction. They jump from goal to goal, idea to idea, and never stay long enough to master anything. But I stayed. I went deep. I embraced the boredom, the repetition, the silence. And in that silence, I built something no one could take from me: unbreakable focus. So I ask you now, what is stealing your focus? What distractions are you still allowing into your life that you know don't belong? Who or what is robbing you of your time, your clarity, your alignment? Because until you cut those things out, belief will always feel unstable. Confidence will always need to be forced, and progress will always be slow. But the moment you protect your focus, everything changes. Your energy becomes directed. Your thoughts become clear. Your actions become powerful. And your results begin to compound. That is how I lived. That is how I moved. not as someone chasing everything, but as someone committed to one thing. I didn't try to become everything for everyone. I chose who I was, and I devoted my focus to becoming that man fully. That is the root of all power, not in doing more, but in doing what matters with everything you've got. Everything I've shared with you is not theory. It's not motivational fluff. It's a blueprint built from pain, from discipline, from years of solitude, failure, and relentless self-examination. I didn't become who I am by accident. I became Bruce Lee because I made deliberate, sometimes uncomfortable, but always powerful choices again and again until they became a part of me. I didn't train just to fight. I trained to become someone I respected, someone I could trust under pressure, someone who didn't flinch when life got heavy. That is the real victory, not the applause, not the spotlight, but the quiet knowing that you've built a mind and spirit that cannot be shaken. I stopped worshiping limits because I knew they were man-made. I made my mind stronger than my feelings because I refused to let emotions control my future. I removed weak voice 7 when they came from people I loved because I understood that clarity demands sacrifice. I turned discipline into a language, something my body and soul could understand through repetition. I reprogrammed failure into feedback so I could evolve faster, sharper, and more intelligently than anyone around me. I didn't wait for others to believe in me. I trained my identity so deeply that belief became who I was. I acted like a master before the world saw one, not because I was pretending, but because I was preparing. And through it all, I protected my focus like it was sacred, because it is. This was not about ego. It was about integrity. I didn't want to appear powerful. I wanted to be powerful. And real power begins when you no longer need the world's permission to be who you are. That's what I want for you. I want you to stop waiting. Stop hesitating. Stop shrinking to fit into a life that was built for someone else's comfort. Decide who you are, and then build that identity every single day until nothing and no one can break it. You don't need more time. You don't need more talent. You need a decision. You need to choose belief, not the kind that wavers with results, but the kind that's carved into your way of life, the kind that shows up when no one's watching, the kind that doesn't ask for proof because it is the proof. That is what it means to be unstoppable. That is what it means to live fully. And that is how I lived.